Welcome to the broadcast. I am Clarence William Page. I hope you are having a wonderful day today. I actually am. It is a good day for a webinar, and I thank you for being with me. Our topic today is a question. Researchers creating humanized mice or researchers creating humanized mice. My interest was piqued when I read an article to that extent, and thus I thought it necessary to begin this dialogue concerning the possibility that researchers are creating humanized mice. The allegation, the allegation says that researchers are preparing to use human fetal tissue to create humanized mice. In other words, they're saying that researchers are placing human brain cells into mice. That for me is a problem. They're saying that researchers are obtaining the brain cells of human embryos, babies in the womb. The allegation is that even at least one governmental agency in the United States of America is and has contracted with a sole source provider to provide those human brain cells that are to be implanted into allegedly the brains of mice. For me, that created a problem. What is a humanized mice? Well, according to my research, they said that the researchers' intent is to create mice that have human immune systems. It might sound like something necessary and helpful because science has been able to discover many cures for various illnesses of human beings, and it may look like a noble endeavor. But the question is it really? Is it really a noble endeavor? And by the way, have you heard this allegation? Have you heard that researchers are preparing to, are already involved in creating humanized mice? I would like to know. I have put up a poll for you, and if you would respond, have you heard the allegation that researchers are creating humanized mice? If you have heard that allegation, please respond. And if you haven't, please respond. We'll leave the poll up for another 10 seconds and we'll close it. What are the ramifications of humanized mice? I think there are ethical ramifications. We can do many things, but the question is, what things should we do? Just because we can do many things, does that mean that we should do everything that we can do? Some things I would say we should not do. And in particular, I would say we should not create humanized mice. Thus, our discussion purpose here is to examine this situation, to create a dialogue so that many opinions may be given and that guidance may be provided. Biotech ethics, can versus should. Yes, we can do that. We can implant human brain cells into mice, but should we do that? Some things should not be done. And that's my point here. Just because we should and just because we can doesn't mean that, and I should say we should. My point was just because we can does not mean that we should. Let's look at what an ethic is. And in fact, ethics itself, an ethic is a principle of right or good conduct or a body of such principles. A principle of right or good conduct or a body of such principles we learn from Mr. Webster's dictionary and other studies. Ethic, a principle of right or good conduct. Conduct has to do with actions, with what we do. If there can be right conduct, then there can be wrong conduct. If there can be good conduct, then there can be bad conduct. Ethics also may be defined as the moral quality of a course of action. The moral quality of a course of action. Actions have moral qualities, and thus ethics is the moral quality of a course of action. Morals or principles or a principle of right or good conduct or a body of such principles. That's what morals are. Very closely intertwined with ethics. Morals and ethics. Morals are a principle of right or good conduct or a body of such principles. Those are morals, just or ethics. Whether or not something is ethical, we look at the action, the conduct. Is this ethical? We can also say, is this the moral thing to do? Is it morally correct or is it morally incorrect? And so our question would be, is implanting human brain cells into the brains of a mouse, is that morally correct, morally good, or morally bad? Is it morally right or morally wrong? And I do want to emphasize the word allegation. I don't know for sure that it is being done, but you might know. And thus, I will ask you to respond to this poll. You may have more information than I have. Is the allegation that researchers are putting human brain cells into the brains of mice a true allegation? Please respond. Is the allegation that researchers are putting human brain cells into the brains of mice a true allegation? If you have information, if you know whether or not it's true, let us know. You can even use your question feature here on the webinar panel that you see before you on your dashboard, and provide other information if you have it. 5 more seconds and we'll close the poll. We've closed the poll now. Is it moral? Is it ethical to put human brain cells into the brains of mice? There is indeed a right and a wrong. I coined the term pure ethics. That's not from any scholar, but I said that pure ethics is about right. In other words, ethics is about what our moral duties are. Some say, some say maybe, but the pure word I attach to it. Pure ethics, the right. Pure ethics, the good. Ethics is about good. In other words, ethics is about what our moral duties are as they relate to what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. And so we must apply that now to our topic, creating humanized mice, rats, rodents, creating rats that have human immune systems. But the question is that all they have? If one implants human brain cells into the brain of a mouse, what else human goes into that mouse? We don't know. We don't know enough. We are approaching frontiers about which we have no concept of the ramifications going forward. Because if one creates a human consciousness in the brain and body of a mouse, what is that human consciousness state of being, thought processes, experience, crawling along the ground, crawling in and out of holes? Now, no one has said that a human consciousness is being created. I read another article, I believe it was in the Washington Post the other day, where they were talking to researchers, they said, concerning uh, these kinds of things, and they were saying that the researchers were calling them organoids, that they were creating organs by implanting certain kinds of tissue into other kinds of things. And they said, oh, they're organs, they're just growing organs. But at what point does that organ gain a consciousness? At what point does an organ that has human brain cells in it, become conscious in a human way. I know it's a strong, long story because we think of humans as body, spirit, soul, a lot of intangibles in terms of our being able to put our hands on them, body, spirit, and soul. And yet, a human consciousness, can there be a human consciousness inside a mouse? One report I read said that they had already implanted human brain cells inside of the brains of mice, and that those mice performed 4 times better than regular mice. The report said the mice in which human brain cells had been implanted into their brains performed 4 times better than regular mice. But another article I read said that the researchers that they talked to said that there was no difference. And I believe that was the Washington Post article. I'm not sure. But I wanted to throw that out because this is something that we need to flesh out. At what point does any human consciousness develop in a rat that has had human brain cells placed in their brains? Because if they are developing humanized immune systems, and I believe that that has been the terminology used by some of the scientists. That was my impression, that they were saying that they were creating or attempting to create humanized humanized immune systems inside of rats, mice. And of course, they would indicate more than likely that it was for research purposes in order to better understand the human immune system and how to get it to function better and therefore ward off diseases and be a better defense against the various invasions of illnesses and diseases that human beings get. I understand that as a rationality, but the question is it right? Is it good? Is it good? Is it moral? Because if you can create a humanized immune system, then it would seem that one could create a humanized brain. And I would posit that I would conjure up a humanized brain having some human thought, something human about it. So I think these are very serious questions. The article I read, one of them was in lifenews.com, a website, and it is located at www.lifenews, lifenews.com. And in an article published on August 7, 2018, it was alleged that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration was purchasing aborted baby parts to transplant their brain tissue into mice. I wanted to put this up because I didn't want you to think that I was just making this up. But the article is even titled that way. FDA. The FDA, that is normally the abbreviation for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And I believe the article said that they had a sole source provider, just one company, I believe the article said, that was capable of providing the human brain tissue needed to be implanted into mice for the purpose of creating and developing human immune systems in mice. The Canadians have what they call research ethics boards. And in doing my research on this, I was impressed by some of the things they said. In the future, I plan to look at this from the American research cohort. But this particular presentation draws from the Canadians. They had in public domain shared with us their policy concerning these things. And one of the things, one of the things that the Canadians said is that norms for the ethics of research involving human subjects are developed and refined within an ever evolving societal context, elements of which include the need for research and the research community, moral imperatives and ethical principles, and the law. This is a good backdrop, I believe, for our discussion today. Norms of ethical framework from the country of Canada, from the Canadians. And they say norms for the ethics of research involving human subjects are developed and refined within an ever evolving societal context, elements of which include the need for research and the research community, moral imperatives and ethical principles, and the law. And we do thank Canada for sharing what they have. Taking a look at the emphasis on the need for research and the research community, that could be a justification. They could say, well, you know, scientists, that is, some researchers could say, well, there is a need for research. We have people who have illnesses that we don't know how to treat. And thus, there is a need for this kind of research. And even though it may be novel, we need to put these human brain cells into the brains of mice. So that could be a rationale that they could give, but the question is that right? Because the Canadians also say that they are develop these imperatives or develop in the context also of moral imperatives. There are certain moral imperatives, and I'm glad the Canadians use that word imperatives because I see the moral factors as outweighing all others, as being more important than and superseding all others, and as commanding all others. And so I agree in that point with the Canadians. Moral imperatives, ethical principles, they all involve the same concepts. What is good conduct and what is bad conduct? What is right conduct and what is wrong conduct? And that's the baseline. When dealing with ethics, ethics has to do with conduct, has to do with actions. Morality has to do with conduct. good conduct and right conduct, as opposed to wrong conduct and bad conduct and wrong conduct. And of course, the Canadians say that the law, and certainly the law is important because it is by laws that we organize our societies. Yet, in spite of all of that, in spite of all of that, we still have to understand that the moral and the ethical must rule. I coined the term pure ethics. Ethics, I did not coin, but I attached the word pure to it because ethics is about right. In other words, ethics is about what our moral duties are. Some people who don't believe in absolute truth, who believe in relativity, would say what our moral duties might be. But we have certain moral duties. And I see pure ethics as being concerned with the right and the good. Ethics is concerned about right. In other words, ethics is about what our moral duties are. Ethics is about good. Ethics is about what our moral duties are. Right instead of wrong, good instead of bad. The Canadians put some teeth into their ethics policy. They have what they call the REB, Research Ethics Board, and it has mandated authority. The Canadians have a Research Ethics Board, and it has a mandated authority. The Canadians say, in regard to the various agencies and institutions and entities that engage in any kind of activity that it appears to me that has a moral uh, quality that needs to be examined, and they kind of outline some of their things, some of the things that must be examined by their moral authorities. And so here in the REB Research Ethics Board mandated authority, in their mandated authority, the Canadians say the institution in which research involving human subjects is carried out shall mandate the REB Research Ethics Board to approve, reject, propose modifications to, or terminate any proposed or ongoing research involving human subjects that is conducted within or by members of the institution using the considerations set forth in this policy as the minimum standard. In other words, it appears to me that Canada is ordering the institutions and entities within that country to establish and have research ethics boards, and that those institutions shall mandate that their research ethics board approve, reject, propose modifications to, or terminate any proposed or ongoing research involving human subjects that is conducted within or by members of the institution using the considerations set forth in this policy as the minimum. And we'll talk about that policy with specificity a little later. But we are referring to a policy that Canada, the nation of Canada, has concerning research and the ethics and morality thereof. And I want to read this once again, not to belabor it, but I want it to be clear from our presentation that Canada says to its institutions, the institution in which research involving human subjects is carried out shall mandate the Research Ethics Board to approve, reject, propose modifications to, or terminate any proposed or ongoing research involving human subjects that is conducted within or by members of the institution, using the consideration set forth in this policy as the minimum standard. And I'm glad that Canada used the term terminate. Their research ethics board in whatever institution would have the authority to terminate, and they said any proposed or ongoing. So terminate any proposed or ongoing research involving human subjects. That gives them the power that is needed. And I believe it places ethics and morality in their proper perspective, in the as the overarching consideration in research. It appears to me that the nation of Canada places morality and ethics above all other considerations when it comes to conducting research involving human subjects. And I believe that honors human beings. I like that part of their policy. The REB can approve what they're doing. The REB can reject what they're doing. The REB can propose modifications to what they're doing, or the REB can terminate what they're doing in accordance with Canada's ethics policy. Canada says that research involving human remains, cadavers, tissues, biological fluids, embryos or fetuses shall also be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board. I would like to read that another way to kind of make it a little more clear based upon my understanding. Research involving human remains shall be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board. Research involving cadavers shall be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board. Research involving tissues shall be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board. Research involving biological fluids shall be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board. Research involving embryos, and again, the adjective of human comes before all of these nouns. Human embryos. I should have said human cadavers, human remains, human tissues, human biological fluids, human embryos or fetuses. Because the human is the key word. Research involving human remains shall be reviewed, shall also be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board in Canada, they say. Research involving human cadavers shall also be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board, according to my understanding of the policy of Canada. Research involving human tissues shall also be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board, according to my understanding. Research involving human biological fluids shall also be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board. Research involving human embryos and fetuses shall also be reviewed by the Research Ethics Board. Canada says research subjects reasonably expect that their rights shall be equally recognized and respected, regardless of the researcher's discipline. In their policy, Canada says that ethics are not confined to just one discipline, but across a broad spectrum of disciplines. Of course, across many spectrums of disciplines, the research policy reaches and is applied. And of course it is. And subjects, research subjects reasonably expect that their rights shall be equally recognized and respected, regardless of the researcher's discipline, whether you're a scientist or whatever you're doing research on. It appears to me Canada has said that there's a reasonable expectation of the subjects that their rights shall be equally recognized and respected. I wonder if you would say that you have the right to keep your DNA, your family's DNA, from being put into mice. Let me ask you that question. Do you want your family's DNA put into mice? Do you want to risk the possibility of someone kin to you being trapped into a mouse, or at least some consciousness? I know that hasn't been proved yet, that there would be a human consciousness for many reasons, but the very thought of it is horrifying, that someone with our DNA would be trapped in a mouse. Please respond. We'll give you another 5 seconds and close the poll. So Canada says research subjects reasonably expect that their rights shall be equally recognized and respected, regardless of the researcher's discipline. Canada says that all research that involves living human subjects requires review and approval by an REB in accordance with this policy statement before the research is started. The emphasis here is added. The policy, I believe, does not underline that, but we did in preparing this webinar. Except as stipulated below, and they stipulated that, we did not share that with you. But Canada says concerning research ethics boards, all research that involves living human subjects requires review and approval by an REB, Research Ethics Board, in accordance with this policy statement before the research is started, except as they stipulated further on there. Now, looking with specificity at taking a moment to just look at that policy, the actual name of it, Canada's policy there. It's called the Tri-Council Policy Statement. The Tri-Council Policy Statement. This is the policy that Canada has shared, it appears to me, with the world in publishing it in what appears to be open domain context on the internet. Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans. And the parties that it mentions are the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of America, uh, not America, I'm in America, but let me go back and start, of Canada, not America. I'm an American, so I would default to that term, but I must give credit now. All of this that I'm reading now is about Canada. This is their Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans. Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The official title appears to be Tri-Council Policy Statement. I believe that's abbreviated TCPS, Tri-Council Policy Statement, with the title Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, 1998, with 2000, 2002, 2005 amendments. And they list a note. They say, for the most recent information on amendments, please consult the official online version of the TCPS at www.preethics.gc.ca, www.preethics.gc.ca. And so this is our reference for the Canadian ethics policy that we mentioned earlier and that we are using as part of our discussion for today. The Canadians have a cardinal principle, and they say it is respect for human dignity. This is part of their policy. The Canadians say the cardinal principle of modern research ethics in this context, and I understand that to be in the context of their policy, is respect for human dignity. The cardinal principle of modern research ethics in this context is respect for human dignity. In discussing the fundamental ethical issues that are common across the social sciences and humanities, the Canadians say the following: the fundamental ethical issues and principles in research involving human subjects are common across the social sciences and humanities, the natural sciences and engineering, and the health sciences. So it's just not one discipline, but they talk about fundamental ethical issues. The fundamental ethical issues and principles in research involving human subjects. The fundamental ethical issues and principles in research involving human subjects are common across the social sciences and humanities, the natural sciences and engineering, and the health sciences. Let's try that one more time. The fundamental ethical issues and principles in research involving human subjects are common across the social sciences and humanities, the natural sciences and engineering, and the health sciences. And that's according to the Canadians, and I agree with that. Now, they admit that there are risks, benefits, and harms in general, and this is just a little afield from our discussion of humanized mice, but there are quite a few things in the Canadian policy that I felt would be beneficial to you. The Canadians say that Canadian society legitimately expects that the benefits and harms of research shall be fairly distributed. So, particularly regarding the subjects of research, when a human person is being used as a research subject, there are benefits, but there are possibly harms. There are risks. And so they think and talk of fairly distributing the benefits and harms. I'm not for harming anyone, and I don't believe they are. But apparently they had to, I felt it important to let people know that there are benefits. There are upsides, and there are downside. Research can have an upside for a subject. It can have a downside. It isn't always clear or guaranteed what's going to happen. Now, in their respect for human dignity, as we mentioned earlier, the Canadians issue this moral imperative: respect for human dignity. And in their policy, the Canadians say an ethic of research involving human subjects should include two essential components. One, the selection and achievement of morally acceptable ends. And two, the morally acceptable means to those ends. So let's unpack this now. An ethic of research, an ethic of research involving human subjects should include two essential components. One, the selection and achievement of morally acceptable ends. Even in selecting the end, it should be morally acceptable according to the Canadians. And even in whatever the achievement is, it should be morally acceptable. Which brings to my mind that achieving a humanized mouse, in my opinion, would not be a morally acceptable end. Conducting research that resulted in the creation of a humanized mouse, in my opinion, would fail the Canadian litmus test of selection and achievement of morally acceptable ends. Now, getting cures for human beings would be morally acceptable. Creating and designing treatments for human beings that would cure and heal human beings would be morally acceptable, but that's only one part of it. Because if the end is to benefit human beings, part of the achievement, I would think, would be in getting the mice to be humanized. And I think that is not a morally acceptable end. Yes, finding cures for human illnesses is morally acceptable, but creating humanized rats, in my opinion, is not morally acceptable. And the Canadians say, in the second place, that the morally acceptable means to those ends. So an ethic of research involving human subjects should include two essential components. One, the selection and achievement of morally acceptable ends. But number two, the morally acceptable means to those ends. The morally acceptable means to those ends. And so I must ask the germane question: is putting human brain cells into a rat, into mice, and creating humanized mice, is that a morally acceptable means? You see, this is means. See, the rats are the means to the end. And so the means, according to the Canadians, must be morally acceptable. And that's where I would take issue based upon their policy. Moral imperative, respect for human dignity, an ethic of research involving human subjects should include two essential components. One, the selection and achievement of morally acceptable ends. And two, the morally acceptable means to those ends. And it is the means, it is the creation of so-called humanized mice that I take issue with. I do not see that as passing the litmus test of the respect for human dignity as it respects morally acceptable ends. I do not see creating, and that is not ends, that is, but means. The morally acceptable means. Number two here says it addresses morally acceptable means to those ends. So while the end of helping human beings overcome diseases and stay well might be good, but the means by creating humanized mice, in my opinion, would not be morally acceptable. And I underline this here: morally acceptable means. You see, you may have a morally acceptable end in view of helping human beings. Perhaps an intermediate end would be creating humanized mice, but that's also a means. And I would think that humanized mice would not be a morally acceptable means to that end. Canada says the morally acceptable means has to do with ethically appropriate means of conducting research. And I'm not going to say this is in there. I may have extrapolated that myself. I don't want to apply what I may have done in developing this webinar. So I cannot guarantee you that this is a quote from Canada, but it is my explanation. Morally acceptable means has to do with ethically appropriate means of conducting research. Now, it may be from them, but I cannot say uh, assuredly, because I did this research a few days ago, and it may have been a week or so ago. So I'm not sure that this is in their policy, but I believe that it is in accordance with the meaning of their policy, because I had mentioned to you that the means, and that is creating humanized mice, in my opinion, is not a morally acceptable means. And according to what I extrapolate and distill from the Canadian policy, morally acceptable means has to do with ethically appropriate means of conducting research. I can't say they don't say this specifically, but they may or may not. I am not able to tell you at this time. I don't have their policy before me. The Canadians say norms for the ethics of research involving human subjects are developed and refined within an ever-evolving societal context, and we'll see this elsewhere. And this is a problem, an issue for me, because when morality and ethics change based on an ever-evolving societal context, that can spell trouble. I won't belabor that, but I believe you know what I'm saying. If there are rights and wrongs, goods and bads, and if right and wrong, good and bad change as society evolves, so to speak, that can spell trouble. And but I think that the Canadians are correct in observing that that's what's happening. Societies, people are saying one thing is right today, next decade, they may say that's wrong. So I know what they're getting at. They say norms for the ethics of research involving human subjects are developed and refined within an ever-evolving societal context. And I see some danger there for human beings in some societies, because some societies will let people do almost anything. So we need to be vigilant, I believe. That is, careful. They say, actually, I think we've looked at this because I think we talked in this webinar about norms for the ethics of research involving human subjects are developed and refined within an ever-evolving societal context, elements of which include the need for research and the research community, moral imperatives and ethical principles, and the law. And this is just a review of something that we discussed earlier. And a lot of times, if you look here at the last clause here, elements of which include the need for research. And also it says the research community. So there are various stakeholders who are saying we need to do this research. And involved and included in those stakeholders are, is research and the research community. Of course, academia requires research, and we've gained so much from research, and yet it all must yield to the ethical litmus test, the moral litmus test. Now, I believe this is a quote from the Canadians. Morally acceptable ends. The Canadians say morally acceptable ends is directed at defining acceptable ends in terms of the benefits of research for subjects, for associated groups, and for the advancement of knowledge. I'm sure this is directly from the Canadians, except for the italicized according to the Canadians. That is added by me, but in their definition of morally acceptable ends, the Canadians say morally acceptable ends is directed at defining acceptable ends in terms of the benefits of research for subjects, for associated groups, and for the advancement of knowledge. And I'm sure that's those are their words, all but the italicized. Participants and subjects. The Canadians say that during preparation of this policy statement, there was extensive discussion of the optimal term to describe those on or about whom the research is carried out. This discussion focused on the terms participant and subjects. Now, this is directly from the policy of the Canadians. They said during preparation of this policy statement, there was extensive discussion of the optimal term to describe those on or about whom the research is carried out. This discussion focused on the terms participant and subject. They go on to say that though research subjects may participate actively in research, and I may have added these underlines, so please disregard the underlines. I believe I put the underlining emphasis on. But the Canadians say that though research subjects may participate actively in research, so also do many others, including the researchers and their staff, administrators in the institutions, and funding sponsors and members of research ethics boards. So here we're treating how do we refer to the people on whom the research is being done, the human beings? Yes, they are participants, but Canada says there are many participants. They say here, though research subjects, and that's the people, human beings on which research is being done, though research subjects may participate actively in research, so also do many others, including the researchers and their staff, administrators in the institutions, and funding sponsors and members of research ethics board. So there are many participants in research, and they're looking at it and in terms of the nomenclature. And the real question they're asking is a subject just a participant? And Canada is saying that subjects are unique. They are saying that subjects are unique. They are not mere participants. They go on to say they are unique participants. So the human beings on which the research is being done, Canada sees them as being unique participants. And they say research subjects are unique among the many participants because it is they who bear the risk of the research. The agencies have therefore chosen to retain the word subject because of its relative unambiguity in this context, and because the prime focus of the policy statement is on those who bear the risk of research. So they tell us a number of things here. One, by the way, is that this policy's prime focus is on those human beings that the research is being done on, those who bear the risk of research. Brings to mind those embryos and those babies in the womb whose brains cells are being taken and sold allegedly to be implanted into the brains of mice. It appears that they don't have an advocate or an advocacy organization. It appears to me, I don't know, there may be those, and there are those who are against abortion. But the prime focus of this Canadian policy, according to their own words, is on those who bear the risk of research. And I think we're on such a frontier now that we could ask, are we not victims? Are we not subjects when our DNA from our family were to be put into the brain of a mice? Would we not also be human subjects, not mere participants? If our DNA, one doesn't get much more participatory than having his or her DNA put somewhere. That is, in my opinion, participation. It might not be active, but it certainly is passive, in my opinion. And so, are we not unique participants? Were DNA from our family to be placed into the brain of a mouse? So Canada says research subjects are unique among the many participants because it is they who bear the risk of the research. The agencies have therefore chosen to retain the word subject because of its relative unambiguity, some would say unambiguity, in this context, and because the prime focus of the policy statement is on those who bear the risk of the research. And I would ask a question that lawyers will probably have to flesh out. If one's DNA is put into another species, has not that entire family been maligned, mistreated, wrongfully used, and are impacted? And are not they also subjects just because their DNA? And certainly if a mouse in whose some family's DNA has been implanted into its brain develops some kind of human consciousness, I would say beyond a shadow of a doubt that that family has been forever maligned, wronged, hurt. And this is where we are, I think. It isn't so easy now to determine who the participants are, or at least who the subjects are. We know who the participants are. And as a matter of fact, if the subjects are harmed, the question would be, is it not the fault of the participants? Because even by their own policy, the Canadians say that the subjects bear the risks of research. And that's why they are not merely called participants, but they are called unique participants, because the Canadian policy says research subjects are unique among the many participants because it is they who bear the risk of the research. The agencies have therefore chosen to retain the word subject because of its relative unambiguity or unambiguity in this context, and because the prime focus of the policy statement is on those who bear the risks of research. They also demand respect for the exercise of individual consent. The Canadians say individuals are generally presumed to have the capacity and right to make free and informed decisions. Respect for persons thus means respecting the exercise of individual consent. I believe that would extend to, if you're going to try and insist on putting human brain cells into the brains of mice, if that aborted embryo, baby, or as you all call them, fetuses, since they can't speak, some individual of competent ability should be able to say yay or nay. In the first place, I don't think it should be done. I don't think human brain cells should be placed into mice. But I agree with the Canadians that consent must be done. And I do not advocate consent because I think it is still morally and ethically wrong. If it's bad, it's bad. Consent does not make it good. But I believe this policy at least requires the asking. I think it should not be done. And I think consent does not make it right. Consent does not make it good. But It may be, and I'm not sure, that no one is being asked that has any connection to that subject, the subject. Individuals are generally presumed to have the capacity and right to make free and informed decisions. Respect for persons thus means respecting the exercise of individual consent. The Canadians say that tricking subjects is wrong. Says, gives an example, even in the most promising of research initiatives, the agencies object to a person being tricked into participating through a promise of false benefits. And the emphasis here is probably mine. I'm not sure. I cannot say, but more than likely the underlining is mine. Part of the core moral objection would concern the use of another human solely as a means toward a legitimate end. So the Canadians seem to be saying that even if the ends are not bad, even if the end is not wrong, even if the expected and desired and sought for end is not wrong and is not bad, they're saying that tricking a subject is wrong. Even in the most promising, I think that is important. The Canadians say even in the most promising of research initiatives. I think that might be something that those who are talking about putting human brain cells into mice and trying to justify it as being something great, and I haven't read or heard that, but someone might. But the Canadians say that even in the most promising of research initiatives, the agencies object to a person being tricked into participating through a promise of false benefits. Part of the core moral objection would concern the use of another human solely as a means toward a legitimate end. So they are saying subjects should not be tricked even toward a legitimate end. And I would say myself that most certainly they shouldn't be tricked toward what I would consider an illegitimate end. The Canadian policy demands respect for vulnerable persons. They say respect for human dignity entails high ethical obligations toward vulnerable persons, to those whose diminished competence and or decision-making capacity make them vulnerable. Respect for vulnerable persons in doing research. And who is more vulnerable than an embryo baby in a womb? Who is more vulnerable than an embryo or baby in the womb? Respect for human dignity entails high ethical obligations toward vulnerable persons, to those whose diminished competence and or decision-making capacity make them vulnerable. If you've just joined us, let me take a moment to kind of bring you up. We're talking about ethics, the ethics of research, and the core interest of discussion has to do with the allegation that certain researchers are obtaining human brain cells from embryos and or aborted babies and implanting those human brain cells into mice with the intent of creating in those mice human immune systems. We're going to the next point now. Respect for vulnerable persons. We made clear that the Canadians say that they must be respected. The meaning of persons in practical terms within the ethics review process, the principle of respect for persons translates into the dialogue, process, rights, duties, and requirements for free and informed consent by the research subject. That's what respect for persons mean in the Canadian policy. In practical terms, within the ethics review process, the principle of respect for persons translates into the dialogue, process, rights, duties, and requirements for free and informed consent by the research subject. And I would say that the baby in the womb, and I know that you would say that's a stretch, cannot give its research. It cannot give its consent. And I'll leave that there because there are many other thoughts that come to mind about that. Reasonable expectations of subjects. This has to do with ethics and has to do with the conduct of research on subjects. Research subjects reasonably expect that their rights shall be equally recognized and respected regardless of the researcher's discipline. This again is from the Canadians, from their policy. The Canadians say research subjects reasonably expect that their rights shall be equally recognized and respected regardless of the researcher's discipline. Sometimes we think of those who are doing scientific research that they need to respect, but the Canadians, it appears to me, are saying no, it's just not scientific research, those in the natural sciences or whatever, but others in other disciplines. When there are subjects of their inquiry, their investigation, their research, they say research subjects reasonably, and it's reasonable for them to expect that. The Canadian policy, it's reasonable for subjects to expect that their rights shall be equally recognized and respected regardless of the researcher's discipline. Sometimes because some people are at a certain level in their career or at their institution, and maybe someone who's uneducated may come in, who has no degree, maybe not even graduated high school, and become a subject. But the Canadians say research subjects reasonably expect, it's reasonable for them to expect that their rights shall be equally recognized and respected regardless of the researcher's discipline. Special protection for the vulnerable, children, institutionalized persons, or others who are vulnerable or entitled on grounds of human dignity, caring, solidarity, and fairness to special protection against abuse, exploitation, or discrimination. And the emphasis there may very well be mine. I probably did the underlining. But the Canadians say children, institutionalized persons, or others who are vulnerable or entitled on grounds of human dignity, caring, solidarity, and fairness to special protection against abuse, exploitation, or discrimination. I think that speaks for itself. And we talked about respect for persons, transcending disciplinary boundaries. I uh, alluded to this uh, earlier. The Canadians say by addressing common issues and needs, the policy seeks to articulate ethical norms that transcend disciplinary boundaries. So whatever discipline that you are in, you need to take a look at the moral and ethical considerations, particularly in Canada, it appears, because they say by addressing common issues and needs, the policy seeks to articulate ethical norms that transcend disciplinary boundaries. The Research Ethics Board of Canada has great authority, it appears to me. Canada's policy says all research that involves living human subjects requires review and approval by an research ethics board in accordance with this policy statement before the research is started, except as stipulated below. And they stipulated that. I think I told you about this earlier. Now, I think the emphasis here is mine on this before. I think that's the underline is mine. But let's read it again. All research, that all is important to me. All research that involves living human subjects requires review and approval by a research ethics board in accordance with this policy statement before the research is started. And then they have a few exceptions that they list also there. We talked about transcending the disciplinary boundaries a moment ago. Now, the makeup of their research ethics boards in Canada, they say the majority of members of a research ethics board should have both the training and the expertise to make sound judgments on the ethics of research proposals involving human subjects. And they go on to give even some numbers and so forth, but they talk in general about the makeup of the research ethics board. They say the majority of members of a research ethics board should have both the training and the expertise to make sound judgments on the ethics of research proposals involving human subjects. Let's change gears here now. I said I was against placing human brain cells into mice. I am a Christian. You may not be religious, but I do believe God. In the Bible to which I adhere, by which I live, in the first book, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, God says the following, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. So God said, let us make man in our image. That means the image of God. After our likeness, that means the likeness of God. And then God gave them authority or dominion over everything, every other living thing on planet Earth. And I say that the human brain cells, that human brain cells should not be implanted into the brains of a rat. Verse 27, Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. So God created man, human beings, in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. Verse 28, Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. And God blessed them. And God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Flesh. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 39. Please disregard the period or the dot that is before the word, that is before the number 39. Uh, 39 should not have that period or dot before it. But let's read this again about flesh, because we are flesh. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 39. God did not make all flesh the same flesh. Another reason, in my view, why the brain cells of a human being should not be placed into a mouse. By the way, I said in my view, all of this entire webinar is viewpoint discussion. My webinars are viewpoint discussions. I'm giving my viewpoint. I invite you to send your viewpoint. And on your webinar dashboard, you will see the option there where you can submit a question or you can raise your hands. And sometimes I get so involved that I may not see a raised hand or I may not see your question. But anyway, you can submit a question, your viewpoint. These are viewpoint discussions. Viewpoint discussions. I'm giving my viewpoint. Let's read this once again. Flesh. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 39. I would ask you then, my friend, why would human brain cells, which is one type of flesh, be put into a rodent, a mouse, into mice, which is clearly a different type of flesh? And should a human consciousness of any degree develop in that other species, I believe that would be a great travesty of the very will of God. I believe it would be sin. I do not believe that God wants that to occur. Biotech ethics. We can do many things. What things should we do? The Bible tells us about beasts, and God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. That's the way God wanted it. And I would extrapolate from this that when we put human brain cells into a mouse, we violate the very purpose for which God created. When God created, God said, God saw that it was good. If he had wanted human brain cells in mice, he would have put them there. And thus I would say that it is a sin to violate that which God saw was good. Ethics, the moral quality of a course of action. Ethics, the moral quality of a course of action. I will ask you, perhaps, let's see if we have a poll that we have not done and have not closed. Yes, let me ask you this to give your opinion on it, please, before we end. Do you think that putting living human brain cells into the living brains of mice is an ethics issue? What's your opinion? Choose one and submit it, please. Do you think that putting living human brain cells into the living brains of mice is an ethics issue? Do you think this is an ethics issue? Please go ahead and make your selection and submit your poll response. We'll leave it up for 10 more seconds and then we'll close it. We've closed the poll. There is, for those of you who joined us late, let me share this with you. We've been discussing the allegation that researchers are preparing to use human fetal tissue to create humanized mice. That researchers are preparing to use human fetal tissue to create humanized mice. And it was my understanding that it would be brain tissue, brain cells. Do you have a problem with that? The allegation is that researchers expect the humanized mice to have human immune system. My question would be, how can one create a human immune system in a mice without violating something? Well, let's take a look at our last poll as we hasten to our close. Do you think we need to closely examine any effort to implant human brain cells into the brains of mice? Do you think we need to closely examine any effort to implant human brain cells into the brains of mice? Go ahead and make your selection. We'll leave the poll up for 20 more seconds and we'll take it down. I thank you for having been with me for this webinar, Biotech Ethics, the existential problem. My friend, it has to do with the very existence of human beings in the God created state. That is the God created form. And that's why we are talking about the existential problem we've been discussing, biotech ethics, the existential problem. Thank you for having come. It has been a pleasure, and I hope that you're going to attend other webinars that we present. At this time, the webinar will end.